So this is an interesting combination of folks in the room. So we just want to ask a couple questions to get a sense of who's here. We're not asking you for personal information by any means. We just want to, if you wouldn't mind raising your hands, are you a student here at St. Francis? Raise your hand so we can tell who's here. Okay, cool. Are you a member of the community in the New York area? Raise your hand. You can raise your hand multiple times. It probably applies, right? Would you consider yourself an advocate on any of the issues that we have been talking about so far? Okay, cool. Would you consider yourself a researcher on any of the issues we've been talking about? All right, cool. And then interested others. We're glad to have you as well. We have some friends and family that were able to join us. Okay, well, thank you. We appreciate that. And we really do want this to be as much a conversation as possible. So we've each prepared some short sort of introductory kinds of things to say, but we have some questions for you. We're hoping you'll have questions for us. As much as possible, let's talk to each other.
Okay, and thank you so much for hosting us and for you all for coming. We're really excited to be here and to share about the book and how it came to be, because we think that conversation speaks to some of these broader issues. I thought I would start by talking about how I came to this research and got to be here, because I think it's helpful in illuminating the issues we want to talk about. So I am a social work professor. I work at the University of Maryland. And at some point about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, a group of folks got together in Baltimore, there was some neighborhood agitation, right? So there were a few neighborhood groups that were very distressed about prostitution in their neighborhood. Okay, so they thought there was illegal sex work happening in their neighborhood, and they were all, they didn't really blame anybody for the problem, right? So they said that the police were arresting people and people were being prosecuted, and people were being fined and punished, and then they were coming back on their streets, and it was disturbing to them. And they were worried because they were worried about their own safety, they were worried about other people's safety, they were worried about gentrification and nuisance value. And they came to the state's attorney's office in Baltimore and they said, okay, let's get a group of folks together. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, but this isn't working. So this is a failed policy. They asked the University of Maryland School of Law to facilitate a discussion about what they could do. And I was asked to join that discussion because I think they thought I was a therapist, and I was the person at the School of Social Work. So I'm a lawyer by background, and I have a social work PhD, and I do research.
Remind us your name.
I'm sorry.
Remind us of your name.
Corey Shdaimah.
The book's for sale here afterwards.
So they said, come and join us at the table. Now, this was a program that they were considering. No one sitting at that table thought we should change prostitution policy, right? They were really more interested in tinkering with what exists. They weren't saying, should this even be a criminal offense? Could we do something different? And so they weren't asking any fundamental questions, but they were trying to kind of tinker with a system that's already in existence. And as I sat around the table, and I was very much an outsider, so I did not do research on sex work. I didn't study prostitution policy. Like I said, I was sort of called in because everybody was confused about who I was, I guess in a good way. But I see myself primarily as a socio-legal scholar who is interested in understanding how policies work on the ground when they're implemented. And I'm interested in how people who are charged with policy, like the police officer who is supposed to arrest people in certain situations, or how people who are the targets of policy, the people being arrested, I'm interested in how people navigate policies that they think don't work or that they feel are unjust. And what do they do to get around them or work within them? And so for me, this is a perfect, so as I'm listening to this discussion over the course of 3 years happening at the table, that was the lens through which I looked at it. And I believe that coming in as an outsider actually gave me a very valuable perspective, because I didn't really have an ideological lens. I mean, we all have ideological lens, so of course I had an ideological lens. But I didn't really have a very vested opinion about sex work or prostitution or what I was looking at, and I thought, well, let me just listen. And a lot of the people around the table had very, very clear ideas that they knew what was happening and that they knew what the solution should be. And I thought that they weren't always correct, at least from a research perspective, right? Because I would talk to different people and I was like, I'm not sure. So a very simple example, right, of that was around the table, at some point people were trying to figure out, well, who would come into this program if we created? So they were trying to create an alternative prostitution diversion program, but that would come in through the criminal justice system, right? So people would be arrested and they would be diverted at, it ended up being at the point of, within the court at the point that they were making a plea, right? They could be offered this program. So that was where they were. But we were sitting around and people were like, okay, if we're gonna divert people, what are we diverting them to? Okay, so there was a plan to provide services. But there was no sense of who is being arrested, right? Who makes up this population? What is it that they need? What kind of services would they need, or what would they want, right? What are the services they want? And it wasn't even clear why people were engaging in illegal sex work, right? And so I kept thinking, well, how can we really even try to, whether or not you agree with this is what we should be doing, how can we do this without having this knowledge? And so even to the point there were a lot of services for cisgender women, right? And one of the questions, well, is everybody being arrested cisgender women? Well, we ended up doing research afterwards, and it turns out 11% of the people arrested in Baltimore are transgender women. And they want different services. And so would a program that does not know who's coming in then be able to succeed in providing those services? So these sort of very basic understanding of what is going on here, to me, was worrisome because I didn't know whether it would be effective. And I had moral questions about it, right? So what other consequences might happen in this program? What unintended negative consequences might this have on the lives of the people who are being asked to move into this program? So there were questions asked about, well, what would be the price of admission? So I'm actually very pleased that this program did not require a guilty plea in order to access it. Many of the prostitution diversion programs require that people plead guilty to them, but that was also a question, right? And who was even asking that questions? We're asking somebody to do something, to give up their rights, and to put themselves in a point of further vulnerability without sort of knowing, well, would this even work and what would the consequences be? So that's maybe a short or long way of how I came to this work. And the more I ended up finding this a very interesting intersections of all sorts of questions on I'm a feminist, what should a feminist response be? What should a socio-legal response of a researcher who's sort of interested in reality on the ground and the match between policy and reality on the ground, what should that be? And so I have since then been doing research on prostitution diversion programs in Baltimore, in Philadelphia. And a lot of the data that I collect, I'm primarily a qualitative researcher. So that means I talk to people and I do observations. When I say I talk to people who are criminal justice personnel. I also talk to people who are being asked to or who are participating in the programs as they move through the programs. And I've done observations in meetings in booth when people are meeting with their probation officers, when people are meeting in the prison with the public defender to offer these programs, and I've done observations in court as they're being worked out. And some of the many things that I see is this sort of continuous potential for harm that maybe is intended or maybe is unintended, and this mismatch between the policies and their goals, and then a lack of listening to the people who are being impacted by the policies. And so I think I'll stop there kind of in terms of my background. But so one of the goals, this in terms of leading up to the volume, so one of the goals for this edited volume here was to really pay attention to my responsibility as a researcher. I like to think that the work that I do has an impact somewhere, and if I believe that it does, that means I need to be careful about what I'm saying, and it should be based on knowledge, and that knowledge should come from as many perspectives and as many viewpoints as possible. And I have to really guard against, going into something with an ideological bent that might lead me to ignore the experiences that might result from programs that I weigh in on. And so this volume is a way that we as academics, and Santhi and Katie will talk about that as well, But it was a way for us to combine academic perspectives, and some of those perspectives are theoretical, most of them are empirical, but with the perspectives of people who experience the policies. So we have an FBI agent here, and we have sex worker activists who are in the volume, and we have a probation officer, and they're mixed in together. And we did not, and as you might imagine, the perspectives are often contradictory, right? So there's not one perspective here, and we wanted them to be in dialogue with each other, and for the academic perspectives to be in dialogue with non-academics who are impacted by the policies we research. So.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, I'll stop it.
So I think there's somebody else coming in to join us. I'm Chrysanthi Leon. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I go by Santhi. Please feel free to call me that. Welcome. Come on in. We're glad to have you. So my research originally has been in looking at how sex offender policies affect people, right? So affecting the people who've been convicted of sex offenses, affecting people whose family members or loved ones are on the sex offender registry, as well as the people whose job it is to punish people under these registry and other laws. So similar to Corey, I'm interested in how laws play out in practice, unintended consequences of these sorts of issues, that kind of work. So that's my initial area of research. When I moved to Delaware for my job as a member of the faculty there, similar to Corey actually, I was invited to participate in a new project to find out, is prostitution a problem in Delaware? Right, so this is a group of judges, community service providers, social workers, police officers had themselves an idea that prostitution was a problem, and they wanted research that would give them the ability to move forward with the program. So I'm fresh out of graduate school, really eager to take my tools and do something with them. Like Corey, I did not have a background in that particular area, but I'm experienced in qualitative research and in leading focus groups and that kind of thing. So that's what I did over a period of several years. I talked to people directly involved in prostitution. I talked to community members. I did a survey of the women's prison. Delaware is actually so tiny, we only have one prison that holds incarcerated women. So I did a survey there and talked to them about their experiences, judges, a number of others. And I was really excited to present the results of this research, because one of my commitments as a scholar is to do things that I think actually have a bearing on the real lives of people, right? So some of us do research because we don't do well in social situations. We like to be set aside from them, and that probably applies to me in some ways. But in addition, I want to do research that I feel like has some sort of relevance to the communities that I live in. So I was really excited to have this opportunity. And so I shared the research. I talked to mostly women, because that's what I was tasked with, but some trans women and some others as well who were involved in prostitution. And I shared the kinds of things that they said they wanted, right? And they said they wanted access to housing. They wanted some things as simple as transportation. So many of them had been incarcerated for charges related to theft and drug possession and other kinds of things. Very few actually in Delaware go to prison for prostitution charges, but other kind of poverty-related offenses. They wanted access to a bus that would take them from the prison back to their neighborhoods after they were incarcerated. Several women that I talked to described, leaving prison after maybe an 8 to 10 month sentence, having a very clear idea of wanting to get back to their families, to be able to provide for their children, to do things to sort of shape a life that they wanted. But it's actually a 6-mile walk from the women's prison to the main street. Not let alone the neighborhoods that most of these folks were coming from. And so leaving, at 2 in the morning when some of them were released from prison, in the winter, maybe sometimes having been incarcerated in the summer, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and then, in January you're let out with the clothes you come in on. So they're, let out at 2 in the morning in clothes that are not suitable for the weather. And as they're making that 6-mile walk, a car pulls up beside them and says, do you date? Do you want to have an exchange? And people with the best of intentions, if they don't have access to something as basic as transportation, are going to make choices that make sense for them in those contexts, right? So I heard these stories, I shared these stories about access to housing, access to transportation. Many of the women that I spoke to wanted to have access to legal aid that would allow them to clear their prior records, that would also allow them to access their visits with their children, if not actually regain custody of their children, because almost everybody I talked to had lost custody of their kids while they'd been incarcerated for these relatively low-level offenses. So there's some very tangible things that these people were asking for, and I shared them with this coalition of folks doing work in this area. Anybody guess what kind of program this coalition decided to create? Any ideas? What do you think? Given the things I've just mentioned, given my sort of setting it up, I was really eager and naive. What kind of program do you think they might have suggested?
counseling.
You know, that would make a lot of sense. And actually, our women's prison, in its mission statement, says that it's trauma-informed. I'm not really sure how a prison can be trauma-informed, but that's another conversation. So they created a court-based diversion program. They said, if you get new charges related to prostitution and you participate in a program, then we will get rid of those charges. That's it. Nothing about transportation, nothing about treatment services or trauma, nothing about access to food, nothing except we will dismiss your current, forward-looking charges. Right? And so I was really struck at that time by the disconnect between what I felt my role was as a scholar and advocate in my community, and then working with community groups that already, in this case, had a very set idea of the kind of tools that would solve the kind of social problem we were looking at. And this is a problem that I think crosses over into other areas of research that I do as well. Criminal justice tools feel to us in this particular moment as the right kinds of tools to solve all kinds of social problems, right? When we feel our safety is threatened, when we feel vulnerable, when we are angry that we have not been respected by justice systems in the past, we feel like passing a new law, increasing punishment, that those tend to be the right kind of tools. But if we step back and look at it, we really tend to be increasing those unintended consequences to a great degree. So this is where my passion lies. I happened to meet Corey as well as Katie, and we came together to create this book that offers a variety of different perspectives, specifically on sex work. Going forward, my interest is really on future collaborations with community members that are really more collaborative, right? So as a scholar, I don't want to do research that can just be used for an ulterior motive, right? Community members, groups that are putting their work into issues that they want to work on in their community, similarly don't want researchers like me to come in and take data from them and then go back into my ivory tower and not have any further correspondence, right? So these are some of the driving issues that really motivate me and that you can see reflected in the work that we provide in our book. So I'm happy to talk more about lots of these issues later. But Katie, do you want to tell us a bit about your work?
Yeah, so first of all, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, even the back row can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I think I'll bounce off of what Corey and Santi have been discussing and talk a little bit about how I also came to doing this type of research. And then I feel like it's a good dovetail because the area where I was doing my research has decided to look into an alternative policy besides court diversion for addressing street-based sex work. So it provides an interesting counterpoint. So for those who don't know, and there's no reason you would know, that getting a PhD tends to be a pretty long process, anywhere between like 6 and 10 years, depending on how fast you're writing your dissertation. And when I moved to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of that period of time, I began working with Syringe Exchange. And do people know what a Syringe Exchange is?
Yeah,
I kind of see hands, but if Corey or Santi want to call on someone, that would be great.
Would somebody help us out? When you hear needle exchange, what do you think?
Clean needles for people that use drugs.
Okay. Could you hear that, Katie?
A little bit, yeah. And yeah, it's basically the idea that we are taking in used needles or used syringes and giving out new, or sometimes people will say clean syringes instead. And in DC, the Syringe Exchange was actually started, it was started in 1989, so really, really early, by a group of sex worker activists, which is pretty unusual. So from the very beginning, there was this tie between Syringe Exchange and sex work. And because of that, HIPS, which is an organization I was volunteering and working with, they're one of the few places that doesn't just provide syringes for drug use, but they also provide them for hormone injection, because a lot of the clients that we serve are trans women, as well as non-binary or genderqueer people who are using hormones or who are injecting silicone. So we have a wide range of different needles and syringes on the van. And what we do is we drive around Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights between about 11 p.m. and 6 or 7 a.m. in the morning and hand out syringes, safer sex supplies, which include condoms, lube, and kind of any gloves, anything else you can think of, to people in all four wards of, or all four quadrants of DC, all 8 wards, all 4 quadrants of DC. And because of that, I got to know about street-based sex work for quite a while in a really, really informal way, and kind of to some ways the opposite of Corey and Santi. I actually really did not want to do research on the subject. I was pretty happy being a criminologist. I was interested in looking at other aspects related to crime. Particularly, I had come from a background where I'd been working in prisons for quite a while, and so was interested in continuing to look at issues of procedural legitimacy within a prison setting. But about a year and a half into volunteering, the executive director of HIPS came to me and said, hey, we've been collecting all of these bad date reports. And bad date reports are just what it sounds like. It's an informal report that someone can give the van about not even a dangerous client, but just a client who maybe was like a little off or acted a little strange or stole money or didn't pay the full amount. And that can get added to our bad date sheet. And Cindy was like, we have all these bad date reports. We've never done anything with them. Would you be able to help us do some analysis with them? And I said, sure, absolutely, that's great. And that kind of started my slow slide into doing more research on sex work. And after the bad date report was done, and we ended up analyzing nearly 300 bad date reports that had been collected over a 10-year period in DC, in looking for commonalities between perpetrators. We were able to identify kind of serial rapists that had been around for a number of years that had kind of gone undetected up to that point. The next project that we started to think about was really looking at the way that the city was changing how people were engaging in sex work. And by that, I specifically mean gentrification. So the neighborhood that I had moved into in 2009 was one of the places that bordered a stroll or an outdoor sex market. And it was increasingly becoming much wider. I was kind of at the very front of that wave of gentrifiers who was moving into the area, and it was changing radically who we were seeing on the stroll and how we were interacting with them on the HIPS van. So talking about this back at so HIPS both has a van, which is the mobile outreach, and then we also have a brick and mortar drop-in center. And back at the drop-in center, talking to folks who came in about the changes, we decided that now is a really good time to start an oral history project. So we recruited people from the sex worker community in DC, and specifically from the trans sex worker community in DC, to talk about their experiences and how gentrification had changed the stroll for them and had changed the way they were engaging in sex work. And we completed the first of those interviews, and that's what the chapter in the book is based off of, are those oral histories. And it kind of laid the groundwork then for a larger project. So we then went back 2 years later and were able to reconnect with almost all of the original 24 people that we interviewed, and then we additionally interviewed another like 41 people. So we interviewed 65 people in total. And then the next thing that we wanted to do was, so we'd heard about how gentrification had changed how people were working outside, and it changed their expectations around sex work. It had made sex workers much more vulnerable to police interference, and had made them a lot more vulnerable to quite frankly, transphobic violence in the area. So we also wanted to get a sense from gentrifiers, from new residents that had moved into the area, what their opinions on sex work were. And so the last and most recent part of the project was that we just finished doing a survey of about 120 residents from two different neighborhoods, one that has seen quite a bit of gentrification and another one that has not seen very much gentrification, to get a sense of their differences in attitudes towards sex work, as well as their kind of willingness to call police in response to sex work. And that's been really interesting. We're in the process of analyzing that data. But the thing that we noticed right away from the very start when we started looking at that survey data was that 75% of the DC residents that we had surveyed wanted to see some sort of policy change. They were not happy with the current policy of criminalizing sex work. And so what we were able to do with that was then form a community action group. It's called SWAC, which is the Sex Worker Action Coalition. And it's made up of, it's a coalition of sex workers, public health activists, and public policy kind of wonks, was the word I was thinking of, lack of a better term, who came together and worked with our city council to introduce a bill to decriminalize sex work in DC. And that just came out. It was really exciting. I actually was there doing the launch. We did the launch of this book the same day that they had the first hearings on the bill. So that would be really amazing, because it would be in some ways the first city in this in the United States where sex work has been decriminalized through a legislative through like a city council legislative means, through an introduced legislation. Previously, this has been done through a voter approved ballot. There's been attempts to do it through a voter proposition. So we're in the process of going through that, and it certainly is a learning process. But as I said at the beginning, I think it does provide kind of an interesting contrast, because instead of starting with a group of stakeholders, we actually went to residents and got a sense from residents, and residents that we recognize largely control political power in the city, and got them engaged in a way about thinking, okay, what is the policy response here? And then we're able to kind of turn around and engage activists in a way, so right away kind of translating that from research into policy or activism in a very tangible way. So we'll see what happens with it. I'm happy to answer questions and speculate. I do a lot of speculating about this. So it's we'll see where we're at in 6 months. But it's certainly an interesting time to be in DC and to see the policy introduction. Yeah.
We really encourage you to ask clarifying questions as well. This is work that we've been thinking about and writing about for a long time, so there may have been things that we assumed you knew that you didn't. So please feel free to ask if you want to clarify anything also.
So it is now legal in DC?
It is. This is pending. So Katie, what's the exact status? Hey Katie, are you still?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Of the decriminalization
Yes.
policy. Sorry, I have trouble hearing the questions.
No, of course. We'll try to restate them. So where is it? What's the timeline in the DC decriminalization process?
So they've just introduced Councilmember Grosso as the primary sponsor of the bill, and it was just introduced at the beginning of the month formally after two kind of open public hearings on the matter.
Okay.
So it's just at the very beginning of the process right now. It's kind of great if you're interested in this stuff. It's a great opportunity to watch the policy go through and to see the responses to it.
Katie, you want to go first?
Yeah, Katie, you can do the, if you want to do the legal, we've done
So
this
she
before.
asked if you could clarify the difference between decriminalization and legalization.
And I can tell you about the program.
Oh,
we
yeah.
did, and you can too.
Absolutely. And I'm so sorry I didn't do that. So the way that I always explain decriminalization and legalization is that legalization is really establishing that the work is permitted within a government, within government oversight. So think, for example, of when you go into a restaurant and you see like the health certificates on the wall. You know that a health inspector has come and look at the restaurants. Very often, if you follow local news, you also see quite a bit of coverage. Again, this is a DC example, but around things such as like the the hours that restaurants can be open, when they can serve alcohol, things like that. So there's a legal framework that restaurants can operate within. When you decriminalize something, what you're doing is you're kind of, in some ways, it's establishing a little bit of a gray space. So you're saying this is no longer illegal, but we as the government are also not sanctioning it. So we're not providing that oversight or that direction around it. So a number of cities have decriminalized marijuana, for example, and sometimes there's some degree of oversight. Again, in a lot of cities that have decriminalized marijuana, you'll get a ticket, like a parking ticket almost, if you're smoking in public. And the same is true for what they're proposing regarding sex work, is that the government wouldn't have oversight of sex work in DC. They also wouldn't criminalize it, so seeing someone engaging in sex work would not result in an arrest. Instead, what might happen, and this is the part that is currently kind of being worked out and defined now, is if sex work was happening too close to schools, or if it was happening after certain hours, what have you, you may receive a civil penalty or almost like a parking ticket for it. So that's kind of the difference. Let me know, and I'm sorry that I'm having a hard time hearing the questions and comments, but let me know if that explanation doesn't answer what you're asking.
You're getting some nods, so I think that was good.
Do you want to
Go ahead.
okay, so the prostitution diversion programs, at least the two that I studied, so Santhi was studying something that was, she did more of it before it came into existence, and I studied two. One, it was while it was being contemplated, but they came into existence, and when I actually studied them, they were working programs. And these programs tend to differ, but they're kind of within the problem-solving justice framework, and they differ. So you always have to ask, what are people being diverted from and when in the process? The two particular programs that I studied was Baltimore City's program, and in that case it was a pre-plea program, which meant that people would still be arrested and charged with prostitution, and at the point in time when they were coming into the courtroom, they would be offered, would you like to go to the program, before they pled guilty or not guilty. And what that meant is that, let's say they tried the program and failed, they still would not have given up any legal rights that they had to plead not guilty and then continue their case as they saw fit. And if they succeeded, their charges would be null processed and they could be expunged. And we could talk more, there's just so many details, I won't go into, but I'm happy to answer more questions about how much it costs and who pays for it or whatever. But what it meant was, if you then went to the program, what you were asked to do is you were literally removed from the court process for 90 days. People are given a court date 90 days hence. And then they meet with a social worker who basically has a case management function, and that person says to the, how can I help you? And there's a range of options that the social worker will refer that person to, and that person has to comply with any program to which that person is referred over a 90-day period. And again, successful completion, and it's not totally clear what successful completion means. In general, it means even if there's some sort of a non-compliance, and there's a number of different ways people can be non-compliant, do you stay engaged with the program and do you continue to talk to your social worker? And as long as you stay engaged, pretty much you're fine and you can move through the program. What's important to know about that program, 90-day program, is, what are people weighing it against when they decide, am I going to go into the program or not? The legal backdrop in Maryland is that for prostitution offenses, the charges are, nobody gets, it's a year. So that's the sanction. You can be incarcerated for a year, and you can have fines of, I believe it's up to $1,000. And so people rarely get a year, but so a 90-day program seems like, okay, that possibly is a good deal because I might be able to actually receive some services and my risk is not terribly big. The program, and this is instructed, so the other program I studied, which is in Philadelphia, what's the legal backdrop? Well, in Pennsylvania, prostitution offenses carry sanctions that are much stronger. So if you have 3 or more prostitution offenses, you can be incarcerated for up to 5 years, okay? And the fines are like up to $10,000. And so the program in Philadelphia that is offered to people is a 1-year program, which no one would ever take in Baltimore. So they're always created in contrast to whatever the backdrop. That program, for example, and that's much more common of these kinds of diversion programs, in order to access the program, one must enter a no contest plea, which means that you're not contesting the facts of the case. And the judge sort of holds that in abeyance, and if people succeed, it gets removed, and she dismisses the charges with prejudice, so no one can bring those charges again. And if you fail, she sentences you because you've already said, yes, that I did that, and that you did constitutes a criminal offense. And there the program is a minimum of a year. It is comprised of 4 phases of different lengths, 30 days, 60 days, each and if people there breach the program, do something they're not supposed to do in the program, and there's lots of things you're not supposed to do, then they have to restart their phase, and then again, this is very similar. This is a problem-solving court, right? They have to restart their phase. So if you're on, day 170 of a 180-day phase, you're back over there, or day, 10 of a 30-day phase, whatever it is, you restart, and then there's a sanction, and the sanctions are graduated sanctions, and they can include. So the very limited sanctions might be you write an essay on what you did wrong and how you will handle that situation in the future, up to incarceration. And so, again, these are very typical it's a problem-solving court. And during the time of the program, the people participating in the program are coming to court at least on a monthly basis. They are meeting with a probation officer at least weekly. Usually weekly. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but almost always weekly. And they're being referred to all sorts of services. So not only are they referred to, but they are required to. So even if you don't think you need trauma counseling, you're going to be going to trauma counseling, and you're going to individual counseling, you're going to group counseling, and then it's tailored to the person. So if the person needs addiction treatment or whatever it is. In both programs, it's very important to point out, I just want to say the things that Santhi was talking about, in both of those programs, really, even when everything else is taken care of, 2 very, very common needs are employment, legal employment, and housing. And the 2 hardest things to come by in Baltimore and Philadelphia are housing and employment. And so even when people end the program, if they end the program, they're very often not exactly where they were when they started, but they're still grappling with many of the same systemic issues that they were grappling with in the first place. And there's lots of critiques of these programs. There's also, benefits of these programs, and we can talk. I'm sure some of you know some of them.
So just really briefly, I want to clarify the misfit between the kinds of programs Corey's just been talking about and what the people I talked to said they wanted, right? So this builds a little bit on this idea of critique. So what I said earlier is that criminal justice-based tools are often the wrong tools for the social problems that we're looking at. And so in the case of the people I talked to involved in sex work, they wanted employment, they wanted housing. Another piece of what they talked about was wanting to be able to accept resources, services, help when they wanted to on their own terms. But if you think about a program that's embedded within a court system that either depends upon holding a plea in abeyance or actually pleading guilty, that ability to make your own choice free of coercion is not there. Right? You may be able to make a lesser of 2 evils kind of choice, right? I'll do this program and maybe end up doing less time. I'll do this program and maybe get access to things that can help me. But it's not the same thing as what I think most people in this room would feel like if we needed some help and wanted to access, Alcoholics Anonymous or trauma counseling or employment services, all these sorts of things. Most of us have a certain amount of autonomy that we are allowed in the terms at which we kind of seek those kinds of things. And so that's a key mismatch for me between these court or criminal justice-based things and the kinds of programming that's offered. And there are a number of other ones, right? So I talked about many of the people in my study wanted access to help that would help them clear their prior criminal records. So they might be facing 1 new misdemeanor or felony, but if they had 15 to 20 previous sentences on their history, getting that one piece taken away from would not help them get legal employment in the future, would not help them convince a family court to allow access to their kids. Another key issue for me, I'll take your question in a second, or we will, is that services in terms of trauma counseling, drug abuse, anger management, domestic violence prevention, these are really crucial aspects of what needs to be part of solving some of these problems. And many of these programs will help funnel you towards those, but they haven't actually created any new programs to meet these demands, right? So any of you who have any experience trying to get mental health care for a loved one or address drug addiction for a family member, right? There are not enough of these services in any of our communities in the United States. We just don't have enough. And so specialized programs might point you in directions for some of them, but they're not increasing the capacity we have to provide these kinds of things. And so for me, that is just unconscionable for us to pat ourselves on the back and say, yes, we've created this prostitution diversion program. But if we haven't actually, created any of the kinds of services that are supposed to be at the heart of that, I find it really troubling. Just that one.
Well, I mean, like Santhi says, it really depends on the program. A lot of time the devil's in the details. So different programs, Project Dawncourt, which is the Philadelphia program, initially they were getting rid of all charges, and then new people sort of came on board and said, what are we doing? So it only got rid of the charges that people came in with, which were primarily prostitution charges, but sometimes they were drug related as well. So most of these programs do not get rid of the whole history. Sometimes they'll get rid of violations of probation, which carry with them, their own punishments. But for the most part, they're not getting rid of anything. And I think what you might be speaking to, and one of the other things, it's what we would call in medicine iatrogenic effects, right? So the criminal justice system has negative consequences that sometimes make it hard for it to achieve its goals. So if you want somebody to engage in legal, or if you want somebody to engage in legal activity or legal employment, or they want to engage in legal employment, the consequences or the collateral consequences that come with it, a criminal record, particularly a criminal record around prostitution, is actually going to make it even harder and make it less likely that they will be able to get legal employment, and make it more likely that they're going to have to find another means to carry them, to sustain themselves.
So just to clarify, none of the programs that I'm aware of address the lifelong history, right? That record stays with you. So one of my points is, if you want to open doors for people for other legal employment, that's what Corey's saying as well, if you're only addressing the couple of charges that might be pending at the moment, you're doing actually very little. Yeah, I saw some other hands. So Katie, I don't know if you could hear the question, but Bill was asking if we want to talk.
I couldn't, I'm sorry.
Okay, he was asking if we want to talk about sex trafficking, and then specifically sex work matters in New York City. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to address the trafficking piece?
Yeah.
Okay.
So and I'm sorry, I'm going to kind of ramble a little bit in response because I didn't hear everything about your question. So if there's anything I don't touch on, follow up and ask a direct question. I tend to be pretty skeptical of charges around sex trafficking, generally because I see them as a increase in the criminalization of people on charges that already exist. So taking the new law in DC, for example, we already have criminal statutes addressing kidnapping, forced labor, and sexual assault or rape. All of those elements are kind of commonly then construed into sex trafficking. So when we think about having an additional sex trafficking, or when we think about additionally criminalizing sex trafficking, I am always a little leery about that because there tend to already be these laws on the books already. And then we look at who tends to be charged with sex trafficking. We see that very often they end up being applied to sex workers who work in groups together, to family members of sex workers who are often charged under a federal statute that says you cannot live off the avails of prostitution. So in that doing so is considering a form of trafficking. So I think we need to take that with a grain of salt, or think about what we are hoping to achieve or get from the introduction of those laws. To the second part about kind of sex worker issues and matters in New York City, I mean, the biggest thing right now, so the book is on street-based sex work, but really the thing that's happening in New York City right now that I would encourage you all to do more research on is the strike by strippers in the city, or exotic dancers. A number of exotic dancers from large clubs have gone on strike, alleging that club management which, I mean, there's also pretty good research around this, has developed racist policies for not allowing dancers of color to dance on nights when big name stars are in town. Those nights tend to attract more people to the club, and that actually, for example, in a number of clubs, bartenders were making more than people who were dancing. So I mean, I think you're seeing collective action around sex worker issues in the United States in a way that hasn't previously existed. In terms of just policies regarding sex work, so in particularly straight-based sex work in New York City, as far as I'm aware, there has not been any move to decriminalize or legalize sex work. And in fact, several years ago now, I want to say 3 years ago, the Red Umbrella Project, and you can read this report online, did a pretty great report looking at the human trafficking courts that were set up in New York City in the way that.
Oh,
Katie?
sorry, Katie. We lost you right after you said Red Umbrella Project. So could you go back to what you were saying about their report?
Yeah, sorry. So they were looking at the human trafficking courts that were set up in Queens and I can't remember the other borough, but in any case, they were looking at these courts and basically concluded that they were really serving as a de facto diversion program or problem-solving court for sex workers. There was actually no screening being done to determine if someone actually was a victim or survivor of human trafficking, and instead everyone who was being picked up for a sex work-related charge was being diverted through these courts. So calling them human trafficking courts was a misnomer in that sense. So I would encourage everyone to look at, it was the Red Umbrella Project in New York City who did the report, and they did a really, really excellent job of documenting the cases. I think they sat in and watched something like 150 different cases and followed their outcome for like the first 6 or 12 months of the court's existence.
And just to build on that a little bit, a couple of the authors who write in our book write about the application of trafficking laws to real people in real communities. So one of our contributors writes about trafficking policies in Thailand and in the US and looks at how in both those cases we really see a federal, or in many cases an international policy being used to bring people into the criminal justice system, actually remove their ability to keep themselves safe, heavily affecting communities of color more than others. We also have a woman who, having to work within that framework, actually created a safe space for trans sex workers. That was also in Thailand, right?
And yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, and let me say one more thing on the trafficking. I mean, I think, some of the things that we actually look at here, and there's a lot more to say on that, but, so first of all, if people are in fact trafficking victims, what are they doing in criminal courts, right? So there's a whole question about that. If they are in fact trafficked, then they should not be held criminally responsible for the work that they're doing. And then applying a trafficking framework, there is a belief among certain people that any form of sex work is, and we don't have to go to this whole conversation, but just to point it out, there is a belief among some people that any form of sex work is sexual exploitation. And there are some people who would categorize any form of sex work under trafficking. And that, I think, is very, very problematic. It's very problematic because it basically, says that people it denies agency to people making decisions. And in our own research, Santhi and I have written about people making rational and ethical choices to engage in sex work. So it denies people any agency in terms of their decision-making capacity, even when they're making those decisions within constrained circumstances. And it also really isn't helpful. Again, it's a mismatch between what is actually happening and someone, for ideological reasons, deciding that somebody else has a false consciousness, or somebody else is harmed in a way that they may not believe themselves to be harmed. And that's really problematic from an agency perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also just add,
I think,
because I feel like we get this question very often, and I mean at this point, and Santi and Corey can also add to this as well, just because unfortunately there is not a lot of good data in the United States about the prevalence of sex trafficking, which kind of, I think, to some degree contributes to its mystique, because there are so many different numbers kind of out there. In my own research, what I can say is at this point I've known and talked to well over 150 street-based sex workers and indoor workers in DC and the DC area. And I can think of 3 off the top of my head that were under the age of 18 when I was talking to them. So in those 3, then by federal definition would automatically be classified as trafficking victims. So I think the idea that there is kind of this this just overwhelming number of underage, and particularly underage women being sold into sex trafficking. Again, we're not seeing that during outreach in a major U.S. city. We're not seeing it at all.
So let's listen to the people affected. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we all do. But I think one of the things we bring to this as researchers and advocates is to say part of what can help us figure out the right approach is to listen to the people who are affected by these policies, right? So
Are a lot of them in their right mind? I mean, like, I'm not
Yeah.
making a joke when I say that.
Okay, it sounds like you are, but yes, I would certainly say that of the many people that I've spoken to, they may have experienced trauma, they may have some of the same mental health and other issues that people in this room have, but they're certainly capable of making choices and of telling us what would give them some ability to make different changes if that's what they want to do.
So can I just say, okay, so there are many issues where we don't agree in society. So these groups that you're talking to, they disagree. And
Yeah,
that's
that's true
okay.
too.
They
Yes.
are not, they don't have the same goals. So when you're saying, why do the people who are developing these court programs, why do they have a different view than sex worker activists? Well, of course they do, because lots of people have different views about almost everything. And so we did not intend to say that these people share either goals or ideologies, the contrary. And sex work tends to be, anything related to sex tends to be very fraught. And so this is no different. Anything that brings up people's ethical concerns or moral concerns, and particularly when things revolve around questions of sex, people tend to get very ideological. And so we were not, and one of the things this book I think does really well, we hope so, is that it brings different people who are criminal justice actors, they're stakeholders too. So the people who are being asked to implement these policies, they have something to tell us as well. The people who are being impacted by the policies because they're being incarcerated or because they're being asked to be in these programs, they have something to share. And even if you have different ideological perspectives, if you want a policy to work, right, to be efficacious, then you should probably know what's going on and what's going to work. There's a lot of different reasons to ask for opinions of stakeholders. One reason is if you want to make a better program, do the thing you want it to do, whatever that is. And then some people say it's just morally right to talk to people who are affected by programs, regardless of whether that will make our program more or less efficacious. But we're not saying any particular program or that everybody should be on the same page.
Right.
In fact, the debate is healthy.
I'd also add that some organizations that are advocates for sex workers' rights, also, if a woman comes in and says, I really want to get out of this life, I want to do something else, I need something else, they will help that woman. And if the woman says, I really am being trafficked, somebody did bring me here against my will and put me into this life that I didn't even expect, then they also will deal with that. So, but the point that they're making is that it comes from the woman or the person, him or herself, what kind of choices they want to make. They want better working conditions, better, rights, or do they want? But what is not happening is rescue somebody else's idea of what you need morally to fix you.
Do you want to follow?
Yeah, please, we can't see it.
Hi. It's a very complex area you're in, heavily ideological, heavily normative, and very historical, going back to Mary Magdalene, etc. And thank God, in America we don't stone alleged prostitutes. One was put to death by stoning in Tehran in 1982. So I guess calling prostitute sexual workers is a form of humanization and secularization, and a movement away from a more punitive approach. 5 years doesn't sound too cool. Kicking someone's ass to the curb is not too cool. I'm interested in the long view. Life didn't begin with the lives of those in this room now, and it won't end, hopefully, in spite of our president, when those who are not in this room are no longer on this planet. So let's take the long view. A simple mind experiment. A dinner party. A dinner party. People meet, you're a host, you bring people together, they don't know each other, you think they'll get along well, and they start to chat. What sort of work do you do? I'm an interior designer, I do graphics, I do this, I'm a homemaker, I take care of my children. And what do you do? I'm a sex worker. Now, do you contemplate ideologically if you could, as reformers, as looking to tikkun olam, looking to mend the world, make a better world, do you contemplate a time when it is completely secularized and one can, side by side, as you say you're a feminist, along with anything else, saying that's the kind of work I do, I'm a sex worker. Do you contemplate a dinner party? I suspect there's no place on earth today where at a dinner party that would be ordinarily appropriate behavior. So it hasn't reached that point yet. Do you contemplate that that would be a desirable goal? Do you, as a feminist, and then the others can speak to the issue as well, do you contemplate that kind of secularization, that it takes its place in the Bureau of Labor Statistics as another occupation?
Santi's the expert on stigma, but since you asked me, I will. I think that it's hard to contemplate because we live within the society that we live in, right? So see right now, we're at the intersection of our biography and history, and I think it's hard to contemplate because that's where we're situated right now. But I would want to say to you, I would want that to be the case. I'm not sure if it would be the case. I would hope that be the case, that I would not judge somebody by the work that they are doing. And there's a whole question of, is sex work harmful to people, and if so, to whom, right? But I would like to think that if I were sitting with somebody and that's the way they were supporting themselves and their families, and that they wanted to, and they were in a world that was free from patriarchy and where they were making decisions that they could, that would be an ideal place to be, and that they can say that.
Your daughter-in-law, right?
It always goes there.
That wouldn't trouble you.
My daughter-in-law, my daughter, but part of the idea is stigma is something that we create as a society. It's not unearthed from God or for the ground. It's something that we create. And we as human beings, I think if we decided to change things together, we could change things. So I'm not sure that I see that right now in the foreseeable future, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that I could desire, that I would pass a judgment on sitting next to me, somebody sitting next to me, or a friend or a family member who said, this is what I do, to support myself. Why would yes, and I would not see that as a problem, and I would want that it wouldn't be a problem if that person was choosing it out of free choice and was making that decision. But that world doesn't exist either, and a lot of us make choices, all different kinds of choices. No one lives free of constraints.
How about you fellow authors?
Yeah, we see a lot of hands. I think we need to take another question. So just to restate that for you, Katie, part of what our question goes to is how to address the concern about underage people who are involved in sex work, and sort of the concern of how to take into account that the language has moved towards calling it trafficking, and it's really driven by concern about underage people. And just briefly, Katie, if you want to talk about that, I would just add that in the research that I conducted, I talked to 77 people involved in street-based sex work in my area, and many of them talked about family members who had put them on the street. But that's not the kind of messy situation that we think about when we think about trafficking. So this is another example in which an idea is really popularized and we take it to mean one thing that we can swoop in with police or other rescuers and address. But if it has more to do with impoverished families, abusive situations in which fathers or boyfriends or others are encouraging their loved ones, male and female, to engage in sex work, that's not the kind of dynamic or situation that is solved, again, by federal agents sweeping in and doing a sting. So that's one piece I wanted to add to that. Katie, is there more you want to say?
Yeah, I think actually the best work on this actually comes out of New York City by Rick Curtis and his group at John Jay. And they've done extensive interviews and surveys now with with young people, so people under the age of 26 who are exchanging or selling sex. And what we're seeing in the vast majority of these cases is that they are getting engaged in sexual exchange through their similarly aged peers, because often because of other stigma that they're facing in their lives,
Right.
Particularly around their sexual or gender identity. So people are coming out. They are being thrown out of their house or thrown out of their home. They end up living on the streets, and their friends say, hey, if you want, you can couch surf for a while and maybe get off the streets. So again, I mean, in my mind, this is not a problem that, or not an issue that is going to be addressed through criminalization, or on the opposite, it's also not going to be solved through kind of a savior complex of moving people into temporary housing where there's kind of no long-term program for independent living for young people and for youth, because that's just not the narrative that is actually emerging from these really in-depth studies that is happening.
Back page. But so most of the people that Xanthi and I talk to are selling sex in outdoor markets. They tend to be, and so actually, and we don't. And they tend to be engaged in survival sex, right? So they're selling sex to meet their most basic needs. That could be housing, that could be drugs if they have an addiction, that could be diaper money, but that's what they're doing. And those are the folks, at least in the areas that we've studied, who are most likely to be arrested. Right? So there could be lots of other people engaging in sex work, but they tend to be the most vulnerable because they're out on the streets, and also they tend to have the least amount of leverage with their clients. They don't make very much money. They're at the low end of the totem pole in terms of remuneration. Actually, Ron Weitzer has a typology of sex work, and a lot of when you're trying to figure out whether, sex work, sort of where it is on the hierarchy, it's really all about vulnerability and leverage. And so those are the folks that we are primarily talking about. And we don't, so I don't say that the people in the programs that I study are necessarily representative of all sex workers.
So Katie, the question was how to talk about different aspects of sex work, and then where to sort of put things we haven't talked about too much, but like the rent boy crackdown,
or
back pages, those sorts of issues. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I do actually. So I was thinking of this because I could hear a little bit of the conversation earlier regarding stakeholders. And I do think it's important to acknowledge that the sex worker community is not a homogenous group. It looks very different depending on where you are situated or standing within that hierarchy. And very often that group that community does not agree on all policy issues. And policy issues typically do not serve everyone. A really good example of that is there is a case in California right now that's also trying to decriminalize sex work. And the way that case is built is it really will only serve indoor workers. So it is really not addressing people who are primarily working outdoors or who are primarily engaging in street-based sex work. That being said, deep breath, here comes the but. An area of research that I am also interested in is just how technology has changed and blurred the lines between indoor and outdoor sex work. And I don't particularly find this dichotomy helpful anymore. I think it's one that just often really doesn't exist. What we found when we started asking people who were working outdoors, so that's where we encountered them, was when they were working outdoors. If they were using Rent Boy, Backpage, Craigslist, 75% of them said that they were, a very high percentage, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact percentage, but certainly over half were saying that they were. And they had really distinct reasons for why they were. Some of them were both working indoors and outdoors because they felt like they could control traffic better. Others felt like they were getting more of the community aspect from working outdoors. It's really lonely to work indoors and only post ads and wait for people to come to you. That's really, really lonely. So there were a really large number of reasons why people were kind of blending these models. So I also would encourage us to kind of challenge our assumptions that, again, the narrative of somebody who's working in street-based sex work is not also engaging in indoor sex work. Because what we're increasingly seeing is that people are doing both. And so the shutdown of things like Backpage and Craigslist is going to have an immediate impact on a huge number of people, both those who were seeing kind of indoors or those who were seeing outdoors, as well as those who were not seeing those people who are only working indoors.
I mean, I can speak a little bit to my research because it's a question that I've asked. I mean, I think, you know, there's kind of two parts to it. So when I've interviewed the people participating in the court-based program, most of them do have a drug addiction. And most people, so some people will say, you know, you should only take this program, right? So I've been talking to people, so just for example, okay, so there's one woman I had interviewed over the course of 2 years, right? And so and I think she was kind of representative of my sample. You know, she would say, you know, it doesn't make sense. This program is a scarce resource. You know, we should only offer it to people who say that they're willing to participate in it, because if you're not ready for treatment or if you're not ready to make a change, then why are you here? And at the same time, the same person said to me, I saw this program as a get-out-of-jail-free card. I went in because it let me get out of jail. The same person. And she said, and then whatever she says, the prosecutor saw something in me I didn't see in myself, or, you know, there's a variation on the story, or while I was here, people cared for me, or something happened, and I changed my mind, and this is where I'm at. So I said to her, well, what is it? You know, do you think? And frankly, and she would say this, and every one of the criminal justice personnel who work on this program would say, we don't know. Right? We don't know. And they don't have a good way of figuring it out, and people themselves don't always know. So I would say also we need to ask ourselves as a society, why is the price of accessing addiction treatment or housing or any other service, why is that involvement with the criminal justice system, why is that the price, including through law enforcement, like LEAD, the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program that started out of Seattle, that's now in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and perhaps that's what you're thinking about in Connecticut. Why should the police be the gatekeepers, even if we're backing up where it's available, in order to have these services? And things that we know, for example, about addiction is often there is a cycle. And we also know about sex work that people often rely on it when they need it, and when they don't need it, they don't rely on it. And so I'm raising questions back to your questions, but...
A part answer to what happens in Connecticut, I don't know about here, but a part answer to that is people are afraid to come forth and ask for help because the mentality is criminalize everything.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is a parallel to sexual offending too, right?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it becomes apparent when the police officers get there. And that's the debate we're in right now. We've got a lot of support to do this. Just kind of working through what's the best way to actually make it happen. And I think that's a fantastic change in our state. But we're looking to not lock people up and get them help.
Okay, well, thank you all so much. That was so amazing.